Gentlemen, start your engines. If you're a racing fan, nothing brings more excitement and anticipation than these four simple words. Hello, my name's John Kowalski, and welcome to the greatest moments in the history of NASCAR. Brought to you by Biography Software, the leader in biographical multimedia entertainment software. For the next 90 minutes or so, we'll share some of the greatest moments in NASCAR's history. You'll see racing at its best through our collection of rarely seen photos and videos. You'll hear actual interviews from the historic Gene Granger Show as Gene talks with some of the sport's greatest legends. And you'll be able to test your NASCAR knowledge from within our Hall of Fame. We'll start this event with a brief history of NASCAR's beginnings in the late 40s and into the 50s. Then we'll move into the 60s and 70s, paved tracks, and of course the Richard Petty era. After that, it's on to the 80s with the legendary Dale Earnhardt and DW, Darrell Waltrip. From there, it's NASCAR in the 90s, America's fastest growing sport. We'll also show you some of the greatest tracks in motorsports and profile a few of NASCAR's greatest drivers. And don't forget the families of NASCAR, names like Allison and Jarrett and Earnhardt. Then we'll go behind the scenes for a look at some of NASCAR's top racing teams. And finally, we'll take a peek into the future with a look at some of the top new drivers. So for now, strap yourself in for a fast ride as we show you some of the greatest moments in the history of NASCAR.
In the beginning, racing in the 40s and 50s.
You can't talk about the history of NASCAR without devoting a generous portion of your discussion to the France family. NASCAR's entire existence, in fact, is due in large part to the determination and effort of one family member in particular who founded the organization, Big Bill France. William Henry Getty France was born on September the 26th, 1909 in Washington, D.C. At a young age, he became fascinated with the idea of racing automobiles. He married a nurse named Ann Bledsoe in 1931, and 3 years later, the young couple moved to Florida with their new baby boy, William Jr., where Big Bill opened a gas station in Daytona Beach. Racing seemed to be pretty popular in the South, and Big Bill even entered a few races himself. And then he tried something he had never done before. In 1938, he promoted a race. It was a very special kind of race with half the track on the Highway A1A and the other half on Daytona Beach itself. There were a few glitches, but overall the results were encouraging. Big Bill began to see a real potential in racing. France promoted several more races, but then World War II broke out and everything took a back seat to the war effort. When the war was over, France continued with his Daytona Beach races. He saw that this form of racing in which anybody with an American street car could enter had enormous appeal to the average fan. He wanted to organize this stock car racing as a separate class of racing, complete with rules, a race schedule, and everything that went with it. But the reaction of the American Automobile Association, the sanctioning body for special forms of motorsports, was lukewarm at best. France would have to do it on his own. With his vision in mind, France organized a meeting of all those in the racing world who were interested in his idea. In December of 1947, 35 men gathered at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach to begin hammering out a plan. They created a board of governors, and France was chosen as president. Red Voigt was the one who suggested the name of the new organization, NASCAR, the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing. The first NASCAR race was held on February the 15th, 1948 at the Daytona Beach and Road Course. Red Byron, who was one of the men who participated in the organizational meetings 2 months earlier, won the race. Just 1 week after the event, NASCAR was officially incorporated. Now, although NASCAR was now an official body, it would be more than a year before the first strictly stock race was held. The strictly stock division included American passenger cars with parts limited to only those listed in the manufacturer's catalog. In other words, these were street cars that anyone could buy at a dealership. When NASCAR was first formed, there was only the modified class, which was popular among serious racing enthusiasts, but not with the general public. President Bill France Sr. wanted a new kind of race, one that would appeal to anybody and everybody. After all, he reasoned the average man on the street didn't own a modified car. However, people were always buying cars from dealerships, and consumers were always interested in buying the best product available. So, why not stage races that allowed the public to see how the cars they bought stacked up against the competition? So in the spring of 1949, it was announced that a strictly stock event would be held on June the 19th of that year at a 3/4-mile dirt track in Charlotte, North Carolina. The rules for the cars were simple. It had to be an American-made car with no modifications except an allowable metal plate to protect the right front wheel. Now, little did anyone know that this race would lay down the groundwork for the Grand National Division, which of course ultimately would evolve into the NASCAR Winston Cup Series of today. The event quickly drew 33 drivers with cars from Buick, Cadillac, Chrysler, Ford, Hudson, Kaiser, Lincoln, Mercury, and Oldsmobile. Even more promising was the attendance in the stands on race day, over 13,000. France had been right. When the race began, Atlanta's Flock brothers were the ones to beat. With a qualifying time of a little under 68 miles per hour, Bob Flock had the pole, with brothers Tim in the front row and Fonte at the inside of the third row. But nobody was faster in the race that day than Glenn Dunaway, who drove his 1947 Ford to take the checkered flag with a 3-lap lead over Jim Roper and his 1949 Lincoln. Now, it wasn't until after the race that the technical inspector made an interesting discovery. The rear springs on Dunaway's car had been altered for better stability. Dunaway was promptly disqualified, and Roper was the new winner. Now, knowing he was on a roll, France went ahead and planned 9 more strictly stock races that year, beginning with the 6th race at Martinsville. The new class was named the Grand National Division, the top division in NASCAR's lineup. Red Byron finished this inaugural season with the most points to become NASCAR's first strictly stock champion. The next year, 1950, France increased the number of races to 21, and Bill Rexford took NASCAR's second championship. It was during this second full season that Harold Brasington completed the first paved superspeedway near Darlington, South Carolina. The first race at Darlington was held on Labor Day in 1950. Won by Johnny Mance in a 1950 Plymouth, the Southern 500 was born. With the fledgling NASCAR organization off and running, France turned his attention to promoting the sport and helping it grow from a regional pastime in the southern states to a national presence. He proved to be very creative in his marketing efforts. One such event took place at the Detroit Fairgrounds in 1951, when France proposed a unique way to mark the celebration of the city's 250th anniversary. A 250-mile race with each lap representing 1 year of the city's history. The event, which captured the essence of Detroit's rich automotive heritage, was a resounding success. The Motor City 250 was one of the best things that ever happened to NASCAR. Auto manufacturers were able to grasp the enormous marketing potential of stock car racing. Car companies began touting the success of their vehicles in various NASCAR races and even began supplying high-performance NASCAR-compliant parts to teams in the hopes of boosting performance. This was factory backing in its early stages. Now, toward the mid-1950s, NASCAR's future and the future of auto racing in general became bleak when a couple of high-profile accidents resulted in hysterical legislators calling for laws to ban all forms of motor racing in this country and in other nations. Now, the AAA, the major auto racing governing body in the U.S. throughout the history of the sport, abandoned it. Its contest board reorganized as the United States Auto Club, USAC, and its leaders, along with Big Bill France, helped save the sport with their efforts before the U.S. Congress. 2 things greatly improved NASCAR's image from that point on. One of these was Edward Glenn Fireball Roberts. Roberts had been a NASCAR driver since the Grand National Division's 2nd season. In fact, he almost won the championship that year. His 2nd place finish was the closest he would ever come to winning it. Roberts had already earned 14 of his 32 career victories by the start of the 1958 season. And in a time when auto racing needed a true role model, Roberts filled that order. He brought a youthful charisma to the sport, and his background was that of a talented baseball pitcher and University of Florida engineering student rather than the unsavory pedigree of a bootlegger. In 1958, Roberts put his foot to the floor and wowed fans with one amazing race after another. He led almost half of the laps he ran that year, and in his effort did not go unnoticed by the rest of the world. Here was something to watch, somebody to root for. Now, while Roberts had somewhat redeemed NASCAR and recaptured the interest of its fans, it was 1959 that really reunited America with motorsports. Bill France had realized that in racing, as in many other things, bigger is better. He had devoted a lot of time and energy to building bigger and better tracks. This served two purposes. Bigger tracks meant faster and more exciting races, and they also meant bigger seating areas for more fans and more revenues. For several years, Big Bill had been working on a new track for Daytona. The Southern 500 was the original 500-mile stock car race, and Darlington Raceway was the original Southern Superspeedway. But the Daytona 500 quickly became NASCAR's signature race, and Daytona International Speedway its flagship speedway. The 1959 Daytona 500 represented the inaugural run of the future classic race at the new track. The race itself, while exciting to the record crowd that attended that day, was nothing compared to what happened at the checkered flag and the events that ensued over the next 3 days. It was the finish of Lee Petty and Johnny Beauchamp, who crossed the line together with Joe Weatherly's lapped car, that created such turmoil. When NASCAR President Bill France Sr. looked down at the passing cars, he announced that Beauchamp had won the race. Petty, however, insisted that he had won the race, and he was supported by his crew and members of the media, plus a group of fans who were able to witness the close finish from their seats. Meanwhile, Beauchamp took the trip to Victory Lane, where after a brief moment of uncertainty, he contended that he had indeed won the race by about a foot. Petty, however, was fuming. He knew he had won, and he lobbied long and hard to anyone and everyone who would listen to him. Things started to get a little heated up. The debate raged for several hours. Finally, France made a decision: declare the race unofficial until a winner could be determined using the photos and movies of the event. Over the next couple of days, NASCAR acquired every photo and piece of film it could in an effort to settle the matter. As officials began to view the footage, one thing was clear: Petty, not Beauchamp, had won the race. Petty, of course, remained in Daytona pending the outcome. He felt confident that he would be vindicated in the final decision, and he was. Almost 3 days after the finish of the race, France announced that Lee Petty had won the Daytona 500. He also announced that from that point on, a camera would be installed at the finish line and used to determine the winner.
Racing in the 60s and 70s.
In the 1960s, paved tracks began popping up all around the country, with the first of these being Charlotte Motor Speedway, Marchbank Speedway in California, and the Atlanta International Raceway. This was also a decade for some of the best drivers ever. Several names dominated the Grand National Circuit, including Ned Jarrett, Joe Weatherly, Richard Petty, and David Pearson. But while Pearson's 3 titles in just 4 years during the 60s set a new championship record, nothing compares to what Petty did in 1967. In 49 starts, Petty won 27 races, with a string of 10 straight victories near the end of the year on the way to his second championship. The miraculous season crowned Petty as King Richard in the world of NASCAR. In February of 1963, Dwayne Lewis Lund, nicknamed Tiny Lund, went to the Daytona 500 in the hopes of finding an owner who was willing to give him a chance behind the wheel. Now, while standing around the track with some friends after lunch, a Maserati being tested by Marvin Panch flipped over and burst into flames. Lund, along with drivers Ernie Gahan and Bill Wimble, Steve Petrosick of Firestone, and Holman Moody team mechanic Jerry Rayborn, raced over to the burning car and helped free Panch from the twisted metal. Panch was rushed to the hospital with severe burns. During his recovery, the injured driver requested that Lund take his place in the Daytona 500. The Wood brothers agreed, and remarkably, Lund took the checkered flag in his first NASCAR Winston Cup Series race. The 1970s saw some of the biggest changes in NASCAR's history. In 1970, something happened that would catapult NASCAR into homes across America. ABC, which had been showing selected segments of NASCAR races since the early 60s, announced that it would broadcast 9 races. On December 10, 1970, the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company announced an agreement with NASCAR in which it would sponsor the Grand National Division. Hereafter, the top NASCAR division would be named the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. The first race under his new arrangement was the Motor Trend 500 on January the 10th, 1971. The following year, in 1972, NASCAR reduced the number of races from 60 or more to around 30 and instituted a new point system to establish its winners. The point system was revised again in 1975, and for the most part, it is still in use today. In 1979, the first major NASCAR event to be fully broadcast on television, the Daytona 500, promised to be an exciting event. And there were plenty of TV viewers for the race thanks to an East Coast snowstorm that kept most folks indoors that Sunday. But while everyone figured the race would be thrilling to watch, no one could have predicted the incident afterward. The race had pretty much run smoothly until the final 30 miles. That's when Donnie Allison and Cale Yarborough began an electrifying duel for the lead. The feud continued up to the last lap, at which point Allison was in front with Yarborough right behind him. On the backstretch, Yarborough prepared to slingshot past Allison. Running side by side, the two cars bumped each other, pushing Yarborough onto the infield grass. Yarborough then drove back onto the track, and the two cars hit again. Then once more at turn 3, sending each of them up the track, hitting the wall. Now, holding Darrell Waltrip and A.J. Foyt at bay, Richard Petty passed the wrecked cars of Yarborough and Allison in the third turn on his way to taking the checkered flag. What happened next was right out of a TV movie. After his car stopped, Yarborough jumped out and went to confront Donnie Allison. Needless to say, a scuffle broke out, and it turned into a free-for-all with Yarborough on one end and the Allison brothers on the other. Eventually, some employees at the track broke up the fight, but not until NASCAR had given TV viewers a truly unforgettable glimpse into the world of racing. It was during this decade, with NASCAR's future assured, Big Bill France stepped down from his position as president. His successor was none other than his son, William Clifton France. The transfer of power was indicative of the general evolution that was occurring in NASCAR. Two drivers sat on top of the NASCAR world, Richard Petty and Cale Yarborough. Together, they accounted for 8 of the decade's 10 championships. By the end of the 70s, Petty had won his 7th title, and Yarborough had become the first NASCAR driver ever to win 3 straight titles. It was also time for the pioneer drivers, the ones who had been with NASCAR since its beginnings, to depart. David Pearson and Cale Yarborough were winding down their storied careers, while a new generation of names would soon be heard: Dale Earnhardt, Bill Elliott, and D.W. Darrell Waltrip, among others.
Racing in the 80s.
The 1980s marked the beginning of a new era of drivers, led by Dale Earnhardt and Darrell Waltrip, who each won 3 titles during this time. The list of champions in the 80s also included Bobby Allison, Terry Labonte, Bill Elliott, and Rusty Wallace. Along with NASCAR's latest personalities came the advent of cable television, and ESPN was leading the way on that front. Stock car racing became a real media production as sports coverage in general experienced an influx of technology and viewership. For those without cable television, CBS was there with its live coverage of events such as the Daytona 500. One of the most memorable races in the 80s was the 1980 World 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, featuring one of the greatest finishes in NASCAR Winston Cup history. The track's new pavement and some bad weather conditions combined to defeat several drivers during the race. Harry Gant was forced out after his 4th blown tire. Dale Earnhardt's blown tire contributed to a 4-car pileup with Cale Yarborough, David Pearson, and Bobby Allison. So it was Benny Parsons and Darrell Waltrip who ended up battling it out, staying side by side and stopping for fuel only once with just 40 laps left in the race. Exiting the pit, Waltrip took the lead and managed to keep it until lap 375. That's when Parsons jumped up to take the lead, but it didn't last long, and the pair swapped the front position 5 more times before the end of the race. In the final lap, Parsons grabbed the lead for the last time and won the race by just a half a car length. As if the Allison family hadn't made their presence known in NASCAR already, they definitely did at the 1988 Daytona 500. Darrell Waltrip initially held the lead for 69 laps, but was forced to give it up when his engine gave out with only 15 laps remaining. This left Bobby Allison and Davey Allison to battle it out for the checkered flag. Davey rode Bobby's bumper and made an attempt to take the lead in the third turn, but Bobby held strong. Bobby captured the win, his third at the Daytona 500, and set a record as the oldest driver to win a NASCAR Series race. This win topped off his victories earlier in the week in the 125-mile qualifying race and Goody's 300 for the Busch Series, making this the most incredible speed weeks of his career. Late in the decade marked Darrell Waltrip's 17th attempt to win the prestigious Daytona 500. Coming down to the last 20 laps, Dale Earnhardt and Ken Schrader led the pack. On lap 190, they both pitted, while Alan Kulwicki and Darrell Waltrip took over. It was a tight race until lap 197, when Kulwicki blew a tire. Waltrip was now in front and all alone. Waltrip faced a dilemma. He was due for refueling, but if he took the time to do so, he risked losing his best chance ever of winning the race he'd never won. Ignoring the waves of his crew chief, Waltrip pushed on. With just 22 gallons of fuel, Waltrip ran the last 53 laps. When his fuel pressure plummeted to 0, he started weaving the car back and forth across the track to push the last few drops of precious liquid into the fuel line. He knew that if his car sputtered, he was through. Through determination and sheer luck, somehow Waltrip held on to take the checkered flag on barely enough fumes to keep his car running.
Racing in the 90s.
The 1990s transformed NASCAR from a loose collection of drivers and fast cars into a national pastime. Suddenly, the NASCAR Winston Cup Series was finding fans in every segment of society, with more joining the ranks every day. NASCAR-related merchandise was flooding the market and people were snatching it up. On the media front, the competition between two of the major broadcast networks, CBS and ABC, and cable outlets, ESPN, TNN, and TBS, intensified, bringing heightened exposure and revenue to the sport. Within a few short years of Bill France Sr.'s death in 1992, the NASCAR Winston Cup Series was drawing nearly 6 million fans to its 31 races, under the careful guidance of Bill Jr. This was also the decade for racing brothers Ward and Jeff Burton, and names like Tony Stewart, Sterling Marlin, Bobby Labonte, Dale Jarrett, Jimmy Spencer, and one driver who began his ascent to the NASCAR elite, Jeff Gordon. But the rest of the attention belonged to Dale Earnhardt, who in 1994 claimed his 7th NASCAR Winston Cup Series championship to tie Richard Petty for most championships ever won. One of the most memorable races in the 90s was the 1993 Daytona 500, where Dale Jarrett managed to fend off a challenging Dale Earnhardt for the win. Dale's father Ned was the announcer that day, and his broadcast of his own son winning the race ranks as one of the most emotional races ever run in NASCAR history. Up until 1994, the only race ever held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was the Indianapolis 500. But with the advent of the Brickyard 400, NASCAR Winston Cup racing finally came to the storied track. And oh, what a race. It was won by a Hoosier favorite, California-born Jeff Gordon, who grew up in nearby Pittsboro, Indiana. In May, Gordon had won his first NASCAR Winston Cup victory in the Coca-Cola World 600 at Charlotte. At first, the car to beat was that of Jeffrey Bodine, who had the lead through the first 100 laps. Unfortunately, brother Brett Bodine tapped Jeffrey's car, ending his hopes for a win. Young Jeff Gordon, who just managed to get around Bodine's whirling vehicle, suddenly found himself in the lead. At that point, Gordon thought that he'd have no trouble winning the race. He figured that all he had to do was keep calm and not make any mistakes. And after he began to pull away from Bodine, It looked like everything was going to go as smoothly as planned. But then another driver came up fast. Veteran Ernie Irvan, accompanied by a cluster of other drivers. The crowd of 300,000 watched as Irvan battled Gordon for almost 24 laps, swapping the lead several times. Each time one pulled ahead, the other would creep up beneath the leader's rear spoiler to loosen up the forward car. Then with just 4 laps to go, Irvan blew a tire, which put him out of the running. Gordon charged on and never looked back. He took the checkered flag with Brett Bodine a close second. It was only Gordon's second Winston Cup victory, and it came at the first ever Winston Cup race held at Indianapolis. Gordon, filled with emotion following the historic event, took an extra victory lap. He needed it. He had also just won a single race record purse of $613,000. When you ask people about the biggest race of the 90s, many, if not most, will point to the 1998 Daytona 500. Ever since his 1979 rookie season, Dale Earnhardt had wanted to win the Daytona 500. Having 7 NASCAR Winston Cup Series championships under his belt and wins at just about every track in the country, the prestigious Daytona 500 still eluded his list of accomplishments. Earnhardt had come so close to winning the big race several times, but each time fate would step in and deny him the one trophy he so desperately wanted. 1998 would be Earnhardt's year for the Daytona 500. After so many years of disappointment and watching other drivers take that victorious trip down victory lane, Earnhardt would finally claim his greatest prize. When Earnhardt took the checkered flag at the end of the race, everyone, absolutely everyone, wanted to be a part of the celebration. Even the normally reserved media got wrapped up in the event, cheering for the victor. And all the other crews lined up to slap hands with Earnhardt as he made his way to victory lane. And when he took a moment to make a few donuts in the infield grass, nobody complained. Although he waited so long to win the 500, Earnhardt was the winningest driver in Daytona history. With 34 triumphs in 125-mile qualifying races, Busch Clash specials, NASCAR Busch Series events, IROC events, and July NASCAR Winston Cup races, as well as that 1998 Daytona 500. It would be just 3 years later that Earnhardt would be lost on the final lap of the fateful 2001 Daytona 500.
NASCAR's greatest tracks. Darlington Raceway.
In 1950, most thought Harold Brasington was more than a little crazy when he announced his plans to build a big paved track in a rural South Carolina tobacco field. But Harold remained undaunted and he worked on the 1.25 mile speedway diligently. However, he did run into one roadblock that is evident in the track's design. During construction, Brasington wanted to have sweeping turns all around, but a stubborn farmer didn't want to sell his fish pond that sat right in the way of the proposed track. So Harold had to pinch that end of the track to fit in the allocated spot, creating the egg-shaped oval we know today. To this day, the fish pond remains, and so does the track's unique design. The 1.25 mile asphalt oval was ready for opening on schedule on Labor Day, Monday, September the 4th. In the inaugural event, Brasington, with the help of Bill France, assembled a 75-car field to compete for a $25,000 purse in the inaugural running of the Southern 500. Qualifying went on for 2 weeks. Ironically, Johnny Mance, the slowest qualifier for the event, drove his Plymouth to victory with a 9-lap margin. Fireball Roberts came in second, with Red Byron a close third. The banking on the track's turns was steepest at the top edge. In the early days, many drivers stayed on the nearly flat inside of the track, but the more daring ones found the going faster at the top, near the steel guardrail. Often the right rear fenders of the faster cars would scrape against the barrier, creating what came to be known as the Darlington Stripe. On Labor Day weekend in 1951, the track earned its own spot in NASCAR history. More than 82 cars representing 16 different makes arrived for the event, setting a record for the largest and most diverse field in the division's history. Marshall Teague started the race in 47th position and had taken the lead by the 13th lap. in one of the most amazing charges ever witnessed in racing. Unfortunately, Teague was later taken out by an accident, but he was proud to watch Herb Thomas drive his other Hudson to victory lane.
Daytona International Speedway.
Daytona International Speedway is said to be the most famous track in NASCAR, hosting the granddaddy of stock car racing, the Daytona 500. Daytona Beach is where NASCAR was transformed from a dream to a reality. Bill France had an idea to move the storied track from the sands of Daytona Beach to a fast, high-banked asphalt track. It was only natural that Daytona Beach be chosen for NASCAR's flagship track. This was, after all, the site of NASCAR's first race, which was run on the old beach in road course February the 15th in 1948. The flat, hard-packed sand along the ocean's edge was also the former home of the land speed trials, and many records had been made and fallen here. After spending nearly 5 years to obtain financing and local support, Bill France broke ground for the construction of Daytona International Speedway on November the 25th, 1957. Initial cost of the project was put at about $3 million. 16 days earlier, France announced that the Daytona International Speedway Corporation was being organized and construction on the track would start within 30 days. He said the first race would be 500 miles and sanctioned by NASCAR, and that the race would be held 475 days from today on February the 22nd, 1959. You know what it was? The track included 31-degree turns, a D-shaped front straight, and a 3,000-foot back straightaway. It was wide and fast, and it was made for those looking for competition speed. Cotton Owens was the top qualifier for the inaugural running of the Daytona 500 in 1959 with a speed of 143 miles per hour, proving that the Speedway was not for the faint of heart. 59 cars started the race, but only 3 were a part of the dramatic finish: Lee Petty, Johnny Beauchamp, and Joe Weatherly. It took officials 3 days of studying still photography and video footage before Petty was determined the winner. Race fans know that Daytona Beach has more to offer than just the Daytona 500. Daytona International Speedway also hosts several other high-profile events, such as the Pepsi 400 and Speed Weeks. Speed Weeks has gained much attention as a 2-week racing event held each February. The annual series of events kicks off with the Rolex 24, a 24-hour sports car race of endurance followed by Bud Pole qualifying, the Bud Shootout, the Automobile Racing Club of America race, and twin 125-mile qualifying races. The 2-week event wraps up with the NASCAR Craftsman Truck and NASCAR Busch Series. Then finally, the granddaddy of them all, the Daytona 500. It's a great 2 weeks of racing.
Lowe's Motor Speedway.
Lowe's Motor Speedway, originally the Charlotte Motor Speedway, began a troublesome construction in July of 1959. While under construction, co-founders Curtis Turner and Bruton Smith ran into trouble, not only financially, but also with the weather conditions and timing issues. Smith and Turner ran into cost overruns because of huge boulders construction crews encountered while trying to do the grade and drain work at the site, some 20 miles northeast of Charlotte in neighboring Cabarrus County. As Turner and Smith worked fast and furious to complete the track, they were struck with an idea. Wanting to offer the fans more and a good test for the race teams, what if they made the race 600 miles instead of the traditional 500? The first race was held June 19, 1960. It was named the World 600. Construction had continued right through time trials and caused the teams to make last-minute modifications to their cars. Deflectors were added to the hoods of the cars to keep the flying asphalt away from the windshield, while wire grates were installed to protect the radiators. Despite the rough track conditions, 6 cars took the starting flag. After 5.5 hours of racing, Joe Lee Johnson was declared the winner. Things have definitely improved at the Speedway since that inaugural day. Drivers have become more accustomed to the track conditions, with pole speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour. Over 100,000 fans now pack the seats that once held only 35,000, while skyboxes, condominiums, and office suites have been added around the track. In fact, Many NASCAR drivers own condos overlooking the track and enjoy being home for a couple race weekends a year.
Talladega Super Speedway.
Bill France headed the construction of this larger version of his Daytona International Speedway on the site of an Army air base and opened the track in 1969, calling it Alabama International Motor Speedway. At the inaugural Super Speedway event, Charlie Glotzbach set a record with the fastest lap in stock car history when he ran 199 miles per hour during the time trials. Richard Brickhouse, who then drove Glotzbach's car for the inaugural race, won the event. Even though it was Brickhouse's one and only victory, it put him in the ranks with other legendary drivers that had been inaugural winners at speedways such as Darlington, Atlanta, and MIS. One of the greatest drivers of all time, Dale Earnhardt, accomplished a feat that only 4 drivers have achieved. He swept both races during a single season at Talladega. 2 of Earnhardt's wins were captured in 1990, with 2 more in the 1999 season. The 3 other drivers to earn this mark were Pete Hamilton in 1970, Buddy Baker in 1975, and D.W. Darrell Waltrip in 1982. One of the more recent changes at the track came in 1987 with the announcement that all competitive engines would require carburetor restrictor plates for safety.
NASCAR's greatest drivers. Bobby Allison.
As the 1988 Daytona 500 thundered toward its conclusion, Bobby Allison led the way in his Miller Beer-sponsored Buick. On his heels was the white and black Texaco Haviland Ford Thunderbird driven by his son, Davey. Father and son took the checkered flag in that order, Bobby just a fraction of a second ahead. Not only was it the first father-son 1-2 finish in NASCAR Winston Cup racing in 28 years, it was the first victory ever scored by a driver in his 50s. Allison, a 2-time winner of the 500, turned 50 a little more than 2 months before he got his 3rd win in the Daytona Classic. Just 4 months later, though, one of NASCAR's greatest careers would be finished. Allison was injured in a crash on June 19, 1988 at Pocono Raceway, and it took years before he recovered and returned to the scene as a team owner. Even tougher blows for Allison were in store. Davey Allison was destined to die from injuries suffered in a helicopter crash in July 1993, not quite a year after his younger brother Clifford was lost in a crash during practice at Michigan International Speedway. Those tragedies were much more trying than any of the tribulations Allison had endured. But if any driver had a star-crossed career, it was him. Allison finished 2nd in driver point standings 5 times before finally claiming a title of his own in 1983. The Miami-born driver called his own shots and stood on his own principles, several times severing relationships with well-funded teams to drive his own equipment and never hesitating to speak his mind or back down in any other way in confrontation. Along the way, he rolled up 84 victories, tying him 3rd all-time with Darrell Waltrip, and won a legion of fans. Allison is honored in numerous shrines, including the National Motorsports Press Association and International Motorsports Halls of Fame.
Dale Earnhardt.
NASCAR racing has had many stars over the more than 50 years of its history, but it can be stated with certainty that none compares to Dale Earnhardt. The loss of Earnhardt in an accident on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500 had worldwide repercussions. The famous Intimidator and his black No. 3 Goodwrench Chevrolet transcended mere regional or national recognition. He was more than his 7 championships and 76 race victories, more than his Brickyard 400, long-awaited Daytona 500, and other major race triumphs. He was a polarizing figure about whom few were ambivalent. Many worshipped him, some didn't, but all respected him. Fans and detractors alike were motivated by the attributes Earnhardt displayed, a fierce competitiveness, a visage that was sometimes menacing, sometimes playfully charming. a talent for driving race cars that was beyond any and all debate. He was the personification of NASCAR racing and a significantly symbolic singular representative of his sport. 2 years after Earnhardt's loss, NASCAR racing goes on bigger than ever. Whatever NASCAR racing will be in the new century, it will be built on the lofty level to which Earnhardt helped lift it in his years of racing.
Bill Elliott.
To those who thought Bill Elliott was over the hill, who believed the 2001 season-ending victory at Homestead Miami Speedway was a fluke, who thought Ray Evernham was nuts to name Elliott the centerpiece of his new Dodge racing team, guess again. Awesome Bill is awesome still. It should be pointed out that even among those who had such negative thoughts about the status of his career, a good many remained fans of Elliott. Through the depths of a 7-year winless streak, through times when even Elliott questioned his desire, if not his abilities, the redhead from Dawsonville, Georgia remained the consistent pick as NASCAR's most popular driver. And he proved in 2002 that he hasn't forgotten how to win. Elliott scored back-to-back victories, pushing his career total to 43. More significant was the decisive manner in which he won the races, and most noteworthy of all was that he added his name to the list of winners of the Brickyard 400 at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Gordon, Earnhardt, Jarrett, Rudd, Labonte, and now Elliott. The emotional post-race reaction by Elliott underscored how important a Brickyard victory is to NASCAR's elite. Elliott already had a resume filled with victories in races such as the Daytona 500, Winston 500, the Southern 500, and others. But he was overjoyed to take the checkered flag at Indy. Young drivers are rising to the forefront, and Elliott is not the only veteran driver looking over his shoulder, but he takes it in stride. In recent years, Elliott, who holds the NASCAR all-time qualifying speed record with a little over 212 mile-per-hour laps at Talladega in 1987, has rediscovered his short-track roots and enjoys racing a dirt late-model stock car when time permits. That, along with the comfort level he has reached in working with Evernham, make this the best of times for the fastest man in NASCAR history.
Tim Flock.
Tim Flock opened the 1952 season by leading every lap of a 100-mile race January the 20th at the half-mile dirt Palm Beach Speedway in Florida. 10 months later, he flipped his Ted Chester-owned Hudson out of the ballpark in the season finale at the same track. Despite the spectacular crash, Flock finished 12th and clinched the championship title in what is now the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. Now, things were never dull around Flock, who competed in 1953 in several races with a passenger, a rhesus monkey named Jocko Flocko, outfitted in a racing suit with goggles and strapped into a special seat in Flock's race car. Through it all, though, Flock was one of the most successful competitors in the first decade of NASCAR history. He was the second two-time champion, romping to the 1955 crown by winning a record 18 races, 18 poles, and $33,750 and 39 starts. He also won 11 races from the pole, led every lap in 10 races, and led the most laps in 19 races. Flock would miss 11 races during the 1953 season, but not because of any monkey business. It was while he recuperated from head injuries suffered in a freak accident on July 4th when a car backed over Flock's head while he napped in the infield of the Piedmont Interstate Fairgrounds dirt track in Spartanburg, South Carolina. There were other periods when Flock was missing from NASCAR action. He missed 7 months of the 1954 season after he quit in anger over a disqualification that took victory away from him in February at Daytona. And he quit his job with one of the most successful teams in NASCAR history, the Kiefer Chrysler operation, in the midst of the 1956 season. Flock's career ended in 1961, just as the sport was beginning its ascent to mainstream popularity in America.
Jeff Gordon.
He had an uncharacteristic slump and extended streak without a victory early in 2002. And as the season progressed towards its conclusion, he failed to defend his 2001 NASCAR Winston Cup Championship title. But Jeff Gordon is still king of the mountain as NASCAR racing roars on into the new century. Not many drivers would consider a season with 3 victories and a top 5 points finish a bad season, but for someone with a resume like Gordon's, a performance like 2002 was a bit of a letdown. The year before, when Gordon claimed his 4th championship, he joined an elite group of drivers who have won more than 3 titles. The group includes only 7-time champs Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt and Gordon. The 4th title represented a comeback of sorts for Gordon, who had won only 10 races the past 2 seasons and finished a mere 6th and 9th in driver points in 1999 and 2000. Those performances, excellent by most standards, happened to come on the heels of a 4-year romp in which Gordon won 40 of 127 races and 3 of 4 championships. Gordon earned his first championship the hard way in 1995, edging Earnhardt, who was trying to win a record 8th title and 5th in 6 years. The 8th championship would elude Earnhardt, while Gordon, after finishing 2nd in 1996, rose to the undisputed top of the heap in the second half of the decade. He forever left behind the nickname Earnhardt bestowed upon him, Wonder Boy, when Gordon arrived in NASCAR as a fresh-faced youngster with tremendous expectations. The nickname was intended to aggravate Gordon, and it did get under his skin until Gordon celebrated his first championship by toasting Earnhardt with a champagne glass full of milk. From that moment on, they were peers with different personalities and from different generations, but classic sports rivals with a mutual respect for each other.
Dale Jarrett.
After coming close 4 years in a row, 3rd in 1995, 96, and 98, and 2nd in 1997, Dale Jarrett captured the NASCAR Winston Cup Championship in 1999. It put Jarrett in the company of 23 drivers who had won NASCAR's big title. The list included Jarrett's father, Ned, who won in 1961 and again in '65. The Jarretts joined Lee and Richard Petty in a very exclusive club, his father-son champions. It was a long-awaited first title for Jarrett's car owner, Robert Gates, who had fielded some of the best cars on the circuit for more than a decade. En route to his title, Jarrett won 4 races and failed to finish only 1 race. That level of performance proved hard to maintain for Jarrett and the Yates team. In 2002, driving the UPS-sponsored number 88 Ford, Jarrett slipped to 9th out of the top 5 in points for the first time since 1994. But he did win 2 races, pushing his career total to 30 and turning in one of the best performances by a 40-something driver in a year dominated by young rising stars. Jarrett never enjoyed such status as an aspiring driver. He worked his way through the ranks and got his big break in 1990 when he was picked to replace the injured Neil Bonnet in the Wood Brothers Ford. He won his first race at Michigan in 1991 in a door-to-door battle with Davey Allison. That win set the tone for Jarrett, who went on to prove himself one of NASCAR's top clutch performers in race-deciding showdowns with top competitors. He also proved capable in the more illustrious races on the schedule. He has won 3 Daytona 500s and 2 Brickyard 400s, all of which suggests that the best is not necessarily in the past for Jarrett. He returned for his 9th season with Yates in 2003.
Richard Petty.
It can be argued that no driver played a more important role in laying down the foundation for modern NASCAR racing than Richard Petty. Petty, often compared to golfer Arnold Palmer, rose to stardom as stock car racing began to move into national prominence in the 1960s and 70s. Just as Palmer had Jack Nicklaus for a rival, Petty had David Pearson. The two battled each other for supremacy and helped build each other's legend. Petty is the elder son of 3-time champion Lee Petty, winner of the inaugural Daytona 500 in 1959. He emerged from a considerable shadow. Richard Petty was more than a prodigious winner. He was also an affable ambassador, a fast-driving version of Sheriff Andy Taylor of Mayberry. He helped change the image of race car drivers from greasy hoodlums to good citizens with great potential as corporate spokesmen. In 1964, Petty won the first of 7 Daytona 500 victories. He went on that year to win the first of 7 NASCAR Winston Cup Championship titles, launching his career in a time when the schedule included as many as 60 races a year. Petty competed in nearly all the events and won a phenomenal 200 times. In 1967, he won a series record 27 of 48 races, including a streak of 10 in a row. Petty scored his 200th and final career victory at Daytona on July 4th, 1984, winning a stirring duel by inches over Cale Yarborough in a side-by-side finish. President Ronald Reagan was watching from the press box and met Petty after the race. Petty retired 8 seasons later. Tragedy struck the Petty family in 2000. Patriarch Lee passed away at age 86, and the family's 4th-generation driver, 19-year-old Adam Petty, was lost in a racing accident just a month after his great-grandfather's death. Kyle Petty, Richard's son, and winner of 8 races in his own driving career, keeps the Petty Enterprises operation going more than a half-century after it was established.
Darrell Waltrip.
When Darrell Waltrip broke into NASCAR Winston Cup racing in 1972, he didn't sneak in unnoticed. In fact, his demeanor was similar to that of another Kentuckian who made quite a splash in the sports world, Muhammad Ali. Waltrip may have never proclaimed, "I'm the greatest," but he definitely shook up the world, the NASCAR world anyway, with his outspoken manner and his considerable driving talent. About the talent, there could be little debate. Waltrip quickly showed the ability that would carry him to 3 championship titles and 84 victories. Major victories include 5 Coca-Cola 600s and long-awaited Daytona 500 and Southern 500 triumphs. Waltrip was the first winner of the Winston, NASCAR's All-Star race in 1985. About the sharp tongue, there was considerable discussion. Veteran Cale Yarborough nicknamed Waltrip Jaws in a reference to the popular movie about a man-eating great white shark and Waltrip's propensity to bite chunks out of competitors' egos with his verbal outbursts. It was mostly all bark and, well, no bite. Waltrip was a clean, fair competitor who was more than willing to mix it up in spirited competition, but never developed a reputation as a dirty driver. And in May 1989, when a bump from Rusty Wallace sent Waltrip spinning out of the lead in the Winston, fans who had previously booed old DW suddenly saw him as the good guy, and his popularity soared. Waltrip helped establish the DeGard team as a contender, winning 26 races in Gatorade-sponsored cars, and drove for some of NASCAR's most successful car owners, including Rick Hendrick. But he had his greatest success in a 6-year stint with the legendary Junior Johnson, winning all 3 championship titles in Johnson's cars. Waltrip got the last of his career victories September 6, 1992, in the Southern 500. He closed out his career in 2000 and moved into the television booth as an analyst for Fox.
Joe Weatherly.
Fun-loving, practical-joking, hyper-superstitious Joe Weatherly was the life of the party. But he was something to admire, not a joke when he climbed into the cockpit of a race car. Weatherly, as his 24 victories and 2 championships attest, was a plenty serious racer. He just never let it get in the way of a good time. Weatherly won 3 national motorcycle racing titles before switching to stock cars in 1951, and he won NASCAR's National Modified Championship in 1953. He competed in 111 races in the convertible division, winning 13, and he began dabbling in the Premier Series, now known as NASCAR Winston Cup, in 1952. He didn't get his first win on the senior circuit until 1960 at Hickory, North Carolina, driving a Holman Moody Ford in his 61st start. Then he won his 2nd straight race the next night at Wilson, North Carolina, and made it 3 out of 4 with a victory in the Rebel 300 at Darlington. Weatherly won 9 races in each of the next 2 seasons and captured the series championship in 1962. He became the third driver to win back-to-back titles when he repeated in 1963, even though he had won only 3 races in his second championship year. The sidekick of Curtis Pops Turner, Little Joe, was a master dirt track racer, but he also showed excellence on larger, faster paved speedways. He had 3 top 5 finishes in the 5 Daytona 500s in which he competed, including a second in 1961, and also won qualifying races at Daytona in 1961 and 62. He had big track victories at Darlington and Charlotte. Going after an unprecedented 3rd straight title, Weatherly suffered fatal injuries when his Bud Moore Mercury crashed into the Turn 6 wall on the 87th lap of the Motor Trend 500 January 19, 1964 at Riverside International Raceway.
Cale Yarborough.
As a youngster, he would sneak in and watch in awe as stock cars roared around Darlington Raceway, not far from his Sardis, South Carolina home. Not too many years later, as an 18-year-old, Cale Yarborough would compete in his first race, the 8th annual Southern 500 at the Darlington track on Labor Day 1957. Yarborough would go on to win the famous race 5 times. He would also win the Daytona 500 4 times in 83 races in all, 5th best overall, and he would become the first and, so far, only driver to win the NASCAR Winston Cup Championship 3 years in a row. Now, impressive as they are, numbers are not always enough to tell the story of Yarborough, one of the sport's all-time best and toughest competitors, sufficiently talented to compete well into modern times, but with the mindset of the hard-charging drivers of the sport's early days. He was a seat-of-the-pants racer whose objectives were simple and straightforward: win the pole, lead every lap, win the race. His philosophy was the same on a half-mile dirt bull ring or on a super speedway at 200 miles an hour. Before he could reach the peak of his career as a NASCAR driver, Yarborough ventured into IndyCar racing. He competed in the famous Indianapolis 500 4 times, finishing 10th in his 4th start in 1972. The next year, Yarborough returned to NASCAR to drive for the legendary Junior Johnson. In 8 seasons, Yarborough won 55 victories and scored the trio of championships in 1976, 77, and 78. He logged 2 10-win seasons and won 9 races in 2 other years. Yarborough set up his own race team in 1987. After retiring as a driver in 1988, he hired rising star Dale Jarrett, and in 1997, John Andretti gave Yarborough a victory as a team owner in the Pepsi 400 at Daytona.
NASCAR's greatest families. The Allisons.
Perhaps no family in NASCAR has ever seen more tragedy amid their triumphs than the Allisons, whose elder members helped create that notorious band of highly successful drivers known as the Alabama Gang. Bobby and Donnie Allison loved to race. Bobby, who had wanted to be a driver ever since witnessing his first stock car event as a kid, started while still in high school at tracks in the Miami area. Bobby raced under an assumed name to keep his avocation secret. He won his first race in the amateur division at Hialeah Speedway, earning a whopping $12. Although the purse wasn't much, Bobby knew he had found his calling. After convincing his parents to let him continue racing, no small feat, Bobby set out to make his name in racing, taking every opportunity to compete at the local tracks. Before long, Donnie joined in. Then one day, Bobby and Donnie traveled to Alabama to try out the tracks there and came home with more money than they'd ever seen from the Florida tracks. Excited about the endless possibilities, they convinced a longtime friend, Red Farmer, to go back with them, and the success that followed is legendary. Hueytown, west of Birmingham, became the family's adopted home, and racing's Alabama Gang was born. During that time, there were many races where the Allisons and Farmer would end up taking first, second, and third place. Local competitors around the Mid-South would see the 3 cars being hauled in the gate and start grumbling. There comes that Alabama Gang again, and a nickname was born. The late 60s and early 70s were very good to Donnie Allison. In 1967, during Donnie's first full year of racing, he took 4 of top 5 and 7 top 10s to capture NASCAR Rookie of the Year honors. During a 5-year stretch, Donnie started 71 races and came away with 6 wins and 34 top 5 finishes. And being the competitive driver that he was, Donnie drove in both open wheel and stock car events. In May 1970, he finished 4th in the Indianapolis 500 and a few days later won the World 600 at Charlotte. Bobby also tried his hand at Indy, but he concentrated mainly on stock cars. He is tied for 3rd on the all-time list with 84 Winston Cup victories, and he holds one record that may never be broken. He held the lead at least once in 39 consecutive races. His battles on the track with Richard Petty provided some of the most captivating racing the sport has ever seen. In the early 1980s, another classic feud developed in NASCAR's history, this time between Bobby and Darrell Waltrip. Up to this point, Bobby had never won the NASCAR Winston Cup Series championship, and in 1981 he was determined to do so. Bobby seemed to be on his way that year, but a late season charge by Waltrip spoiled his hopes. Then in 1982, the same thing happened, and Waltrip again won with a late season rally. For the second year in a row, and the 4th time since 1972, Allison was second. In 1983, Allison finally captured the prize he'd always wanted, a Winston Cup championship. Prior to Bobby's championship, another Allison was beginning to make his presence known. Davey Allison, Bobby's son, had always wanted to follow the path of his father. His career really started when he began working in his father's shop, learning the ins and outs of cars and driving in various local races. Davey's break came shortly after he began driving in limited sportsman events. Frustrated with his nephew's uphill battle to field a quality car, Donnie supplied Davey with a Chevy Nova frame that he could really build upon. The results were immediate. Davey assembled his new car and then won the first 2 races he entered. Now there was a new gang in town, the Peach Fuzz Gang, comprised of Davey and his boyhood friends. With a good ride and a crew of his own, and under the direction of his grandfather, Edmund "Pop" Allison, Davey started to tear up the ARCA circuit and make his own splash in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. Winning 4 ARCA races in 1983 and taking home the ARCA Rookie of the Year honors in 1984, Davey substituted in 3 NASCAR Winston Cup Series events in 1985 and grabbed a top 10 finish on his way to the show. In 1987, Davey Allison qualified on the front row of the Daytona 500, the first rookie to accomplish that feat. 2 months later, Davey won his first NASCAR Winston Cup Series race at Talladega. By the end of his rookie season, Davey had won 2 races, earned 5 poles, taken 9 top 5s, and earned the Ray Bestis Rookie of the Year award. The 1988 Daytona 500 is memorable for several reasons, including a spectacular crash that the legendary Petty survived with only minor injuries. It was special for the Allison family as father and son took the checkered flag first and second. Just a few years later, tragedy hit the Allison family. Only 4 months after the father-son 1-2 finish at Daytona, Bobby was seriously injured in an accident at Pocono Raceway in Pennsylvania. His driving career was ended, and it was years before he was able to do anything resembling a normal life. Almost before the family could begin to recover from that blow, Clifford Allison, the younger son of Bobby and Judy, was lost when his NASCAR Busch Series stock car crashed at Michigan International Speedway, August 1992. The next year, the Allison family would again be rocked by tragedy. The day after he finished 3rd at New Hampshire in what would be his final race, Davey Allison lost control of the helicopter he was flying as he attempted to land in the infield at Alabama's Talladega Superspeedway. Allison, 32, suffered fatal injuries in the crash. Passenger Red Farmer was less seriously injured. Not only was it in the end of Allison's brilliant but brief career, it ended a long presence of the Allison family name in NASCAR racing.
The Earnhardts.
Perhaps no name in NASCAR today evokes such strong sentiment as Earnhardt. And the Earnhardt name starts with Ralph Earnhardt, arguably the most intimidating driver of his generation. Winner of the 1956 Sportsman Championship, Ralph once racked up 17 wins in a row at North Carolina's Hickory Motor Speedway. His 5 track championships at Hickory were the stuff legends are made of. You could say that Hickory was Ralph Earnhardt's track. Competing in his first Grand National race at Hickory, Ralph won the pole and posted a second-place finish. In the 50s and 60s, there were few drivers with a better record on the sportsman circuit. Earnhardt seemed able to win just about any race he decided to enter, and during one stretch, he owned the championship at 7 different tracks. Ralph's pre-race routine at the track, coupled with his intimidating style on the track, made him a formidable opponent. On race day, he always showed up ready to race. There was no working on the car, no last-minute adjustments, and not a lot of talk with the other racers. He was just there, ready to race. When the race started, Ralph would jump right up behind the leaders of the pack and wait for someone to make a mistake, which often happened, especially if being bumped by Ralph. Sometimes just the thought of Ralph Earnhardt behind you was enough to make a driver do something desperate and ultimately costly. Ralph started in only 51 Grand National races, earning 6 top 5 finishes and no wins. He spent most of his career in the sportsman circuit. Most experts agree that had Ralph focused instead on the big races, he would have been one of the dominant drivers there too. When NASCAR began the move from the smaller dirt tracks to the larger asphalt superspeedways, Ralph focused his attention fully on the sportsman tracks. That was where his heart was and where he felt most comfortable. Ralph Earnhardt died of a heart attack in September 1973, doing something he loved, working on a race car. He left an impressive legacy in the racing world, but his greatest contribution to the sport was his son, Dale. Dale Earnhardt rose to heights of achievement and popularity unparalleled in American motorsports. While his father had built a reputation as an intimidating driver, Dale Earnhardt was known as the Intimidator. Taught by his father early on to establish your territory, Dale adopted that strategy to the extreme, and it became his trademark style. Dale never gave anyone an inch. Until his father's death, Dale had been a little unsure about his future as a driver and occasionally explored other career avenues. But the specter of having a normal job, combined with losing the greatest influence in his life, seemed to harden Dale's resolve in becoming the best he could be in the world of racing. In 1978, Earnhardt scored his first top 5 finish, 4th in the Dixie 400 at Atlanta. That led to a full-time ride the next season, his first solid opportunity with a new team fielded by Californian Rod Osterlund. The 27-year-old Earnhardt won his first race in the 7th race of the season at Bristol. Despite missing some races because of injuries sustained in a crash at Pocono late in the year, he rolled to Rookie of the Year honors. The next year, 1980, Dale achieved what had previously been unachievable. Continuing on his torrid pace, he became the first driver ever to win the Rookie Award and NASCAR Winston Cup Series championship in consecutive seasons. He finished the year with 5 wins, 19 top 5s, and 24 top 10s. It would be the first of a record-tying 7 championships for Dale, whose black number 3 Chevrolet Monte Carlo would become one of the most recognized symbols of NASCAR. One of the greatest tragedies in NASCAR history occurred in February 2001. In the last lap of the Daytona 500, Earnhardt was lost in an accident. Finishing first and second were 2 cars from the Dale Earnhardt Incorporated race team. The drivers were Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr. The 49-year-old Earnhardt seemed to have rebounded from a slump that left him winless in 1997. He had finished second in driver points to Bobby Labonte the year before and was set on winning a record 8th championship. Few doubted he still had the ability to achieve the 8th title, but it was not to be. The torch has been passed to Little League, Ralph Dale Earnhardt Jr., who has shown great promise. Jr. started racing at age 16, working in the service department of his dad's Chevrolet dealership in Newton, North Carolina, and maintaining his own race cars with his brother, Kerry, and sister, Kelly. From 1994 to 1996, Jr. started in 113 races in the NASCAR Dodge Weekly Series late model division and came away with 3 wins and an astonishing 90 top 10 finishes. In 1997, Little E moved up to the NASCAR Busch Series and won consecutive championships in 1998 and 99. The next year, as a rookie in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series, he got 2 victories plus a win in the Winston, NASCAR's all-star race. He was the first rookie to win the special non-points event. Meanwhile, brother Kerry has landed a full-time NASCAR Busch Series ride with a team co-owned by former Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback Terry Bradshaw. The Earnhardt name lives on in its 3rd generation.
The Jarretts.
Contemporary race fans know Ned Jarrett as a prominent television and radio commentator. Most know that Jarrett, now retired from his broadcasting career, won 2 NASCAR Winston Cup Series championship titles, and that his son Dale is one of the top stars of the sport. The Jarrett family's roots in the sport are deep. Ned, showing an early knack for making money from various business ventures, took his business-like approach to the fledgling sport of stock car racing in the 1950s. He became one of the top drivers in the sport before retiring at the peak of his career in 1966. Ned had a style that was markedly different from many other drivers of his era. He preferred to think his way through a race instead of relying on sheer muscle. Over the years, he was tagged with the nickname Gentleman Ned for his non-confrontational way of winning races. It seemed to work for Ned. By the end of the 50s, he had won 2 sportsman championships. Like most every move he made, Jarrett's decision to try the Grand National ranks was a logical, business-based decision. Jarrett was making good money racing in the sportsman division, but felt there was a bigger prize to be had in the long run in Grand National. In 1961, Ned won the championship title. That led to a relationship with Ford and a secure place among the factory-backed drivers who dominated the sport in the 1960s. Jarrett, driving for brothers Bondi, Walter, and Nicky Long of Camden, South Carolina, had his best season in 1965, winning 13 races, including the Southern 500, by a whopping 14 laps over second-place Buck Baker in capturing his 2nd championship. The next year, Ned began to look beyond racing and toward the security of his family. At the young age of 34, Ned Jarrett retired from competitive racing after October's race at Rockingham. He is the only driver ever to retire as the defending NASCAR Grand National champion. Growing up in the Jarrett household meant spending many afternoons at the track. Such was the norm for Glenn and Dale Jarrett and their sister Patty. Both sons would follow in their father's footsteps. Glenn gave racing a try and then turned to broadcasting, while Dale, a star athlete in high school, turned to local short track racing. Like his father, Dale ran his first race at Hickory in 1977. He won the Limited Sportsman Division Rookie of the Year at that track. Dale's career had begun. In 1982, Dale was a regular in the NASCAR Busch Series. It was soon obvious that Dale had a lot of the characteristics of his father, the same intelligent, reasoned approach to racing that had made Ned Jarrett a legend. Joining the Wood brothers, Dale won his first NASCAR Winston Cup Series race at the Michigan International Speedway in 1991. Then in 1992, his big break came when he was asked to race for former Washington Redskins coach Joe Gibbs. The arrangement proved to be a good one. That next year, Dale qualified 2nd for the Daytona 500. This set the stage for one of the most poignant moments in NASCAR history, and a truly memorable one for the Jarrett family. With Ned Jarrett in the booth announcing the race, his son held off the challenges of NASCAR's famous intimidator, Dale Earnhardt, and narrowly won this most prestigious of races. It was a tearful, joyous moment as Ned watched his son cross the finish line. In the coming years, the scene would be repeated as Dale Jarrett picked up 2nd and 3rd wins in the Daytona Classic. In 1999, Dale had his best year ever and won the NASCAR Winston Cup Series championship. Together with his dad, they became only the 2nd father-son duo to win the championship, joining Lee and Richard Petty. In 1991, carrying on the Jarrett legacy, Jason, Dale's son, entered racing. Like his father and his grandfather, Jason found himself racing at Hickory also. And in 1994, Jason won Hickory's Limited Sportsman Division Rookie of the Year award, just like his father.
The Petties.
Lee Petty started racing at a time when you drove to the track in the car you were going to race, and then drove home in the same car afterward, if it was still in one piece. And that wasn't always the case. In the first NASCAR race ever, an event held at a 3/4-mile dirt track in Charlotte, North Carolina, Petty borrowed a Buick from a friend, drove it to the track, and entered it in the race. Everything went well until the sway bar came off and the car rolled several times. Petty was relatively unhurt, but the car had to be taken away on a flatbed truck. Although the outcome of this race was unfortunate for Lee Petty, it also marked the beginning of a long and successful career that would help shape NASCAR as we know it today and eventually call his sons, grandson, and even great-grandson. After the race in Charlotte, realizing that he had needed something more substantial than an old borrowed car to win races, Lee Petty bought a 1949 Plymouth and entered the business of racing. Petty Enterprises was off and running. During the first 11 years of NASCAR's existence, Lee Petty never finished a season lower than 4th in points. In 1959, he became the first 3-time Grand National Champion. That same year, Lee won the inaugural Daytona 500 in a finish that was so close it required 3 days to confirm him as the winner. In his first NASCAR Grand National race in 1958, Richard Petty, Lee's son, was introduced to a side of his father he had never seen, that of a competitor. As Lee Petty and Cotton Owens were battling for position, they came upon young Richard, whom they were in the process of lapping. Apparently, Richard didn't move out of the way fast enough. He was unceremoniously knocked into the wall by his father, who went on to win his second Grand National title that year. A lesson learned. At Charlotte in 1960, Richard Petty was desperately clinging on to a narrow lead over challenger Rex White. Suddenly, a skirmish developed between White and Lee Petty, and Richard was able to use the distraction to his advantage by lengthening his lead and eventually winning the race. That year, Richard finished second in the run for the Grand National title. In February 1961, Lee and Richard Petty were both involved in spectacular crashes during the 100-mile qualifying races prior to the Daytona 500. Lee was seriously injured, and his driving career was all but ended. Richard and his brother Maurice took on the mantle of responsibility for the family business. For a while, Maurice tried his hand at driving, but quickly decided that his skills were behind the scenes building engines, not driving. Richard was the driver. And so in 1962, Richard and Maurice began one of the most phenomenal runs in NASCAR history. In the next 3 years, Richard finished second in the NASCAR Grand National Championship for 2 consecutive years before winning his first title in 1964. During that time, he won 31 races with 121 top tens, including the 1964 Daytona 500, and collected over $100,000 for the first time in his career. In 1967, when there were as many as 60 or more races each year, Richard Petty accomplished a feat that likely will never be equaled in NASCAR. He won 27 of 48 starts, including a victory streak of 10 races in a row. Petty won his second championship that year and began to be known as King Richard. Things continued well for Petty through 1979 when he won his 7th championship. That was the year that a new Petty emerged on the scene, Richard's son Kyle. A more easygoing and liberal personality than his father, Kyle Petty began his career by winning an ARCA race just days before the Daytona 500, which his father won by holding off Darrell Waltrip on the last lap. It was the 6th of 7 Daytona 500s Petty would claim. Richard Petty's last year of racing was 1992. At age 55, he had accumulated 200 NASCAR Winston Cup victories. He was also the first driver to earn over $1 million in racing, having reached that plateau in 1971. In 1989, Kyle had signed on with millionaire and racing aficionado Felix Sabates, and the number of wins began to increase. His success with Sabates included 2 fifth-place NASCAR Winston Cup Series points finishes. Then in 1991, at a race in Talladega, Kyle sustained a broken leg, which sidelined him for half the season. Perhaps this was an indication of things to come. After he recovered, Kyle spent a few more seasons with Sabates and then things started downhill. After several mediocre seasons and only one win, Kyle left Sabatis. In 1997, Kyle Petty rejoined the family business. It would be soon after this long-awaited reunion that another Petty would begin his brief but colorful career, Kyle's son Adam, and become the first fourth-generation sports figure. Adam raced short-track late-model stock cars before moving up to a regional series, and he won his first race in June 1998. A few months later, Adam entered his first race on a major speedway, an ARCA stock car event at Charlotte Motor Speedway. Like his dad had done in 1979, Adam won his ARCA debut and thus became that series' youngest winner. Adam made his NASCAR Winston Cup Series debut at Texas Motor Speedway in April 2000. It looked as if the newest member of the Petty racing clan was in the earliest stages of a long and successful racing career. Adam was to be the centerpiece of the Petty Enterprises team as it returned to Dodge in 2001. But it was not to be. In May of 2000, Adam Petty was lost while taking a practice run at New Hampshire International Speedway. The accident closed prematurely another chapter in the remarkable history of the Petty family.
Behind the scenes. Dale Earnhardt Incorporated.
In 1982, NASCAR officials reorganized the NASCAR Sportsman Division into what is now the NASCAR Busch Series, a touring league one step below the Premier Series. Dale Earnhardt was a regular competitor in the series and formed his own team to field cars in the Junior Series. That team grew into Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. Earnhardt won the first race in the new series at Daytona in February 1982. In the 12 years that followed, Earnhardt's team won 21 races, including 6 Daytona 300s. The overwhelming success of his team convinced the owner to branch out into the other major divisions of NASCAR, Craftsman Truck, and Winston Cup. Although Earnhardt was committed to finishing his own career driving for Richard Childress Racing, it was time for the Dale Earnhardt Incorporated team to move up to the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. After a few trial events in 1996 and 97, the team became a full-time participant in 1998 with Park as the driver. Earnhardt's son Dale Jr. took over the driving responsibilities in the NASCAR Busch Series. Park's rookie season was derailed when he was hurt in an accident at Atlanta. Dale Jr. and Hornaday, however, did quite well, winning the title in their respective divisions. Needing a replacement driver for his NASCAR Winston Cup car, Earnhardt signed Darrell Waltrip, who responded by giving the new team their first top 5 and top 10 finishes. In 1999, things just got better, and Dale Jr. won his second NASCAR Busch Series championship. His success led Dale Sr. to agree to a 5-race NASCAR Winston Cup introduction for the younger Earnhardt, driving a Budweiser-sponsored car. The year 2000 marked the first victories for the NASCAR Winston Cup team, with Earnhardt Jr. claiming victories at Texas and Richmond, and Park also getting a win at Watkins Glen. A third team was to be added in 2001 with Michael Waltrip as the driver. In the first race of the year, the Daytona 500, Waltrip won his first victory, but Earnhardt lost his life in an accident on the final lap. Dale Jr., devastated by the death of his father, somehow went on to win 3 races that year, including the July race at Daytona, and finished in the top 10 in final point standing. The team continues under the direction of Earnhardt's widow, Teresa, and has established itself as one of the top operations in racing.
Hendrick Motorsports.
When car dealer and former boat racer Rick Hendrick formed his own stock car team in 1984, he hired the best people he could to make his dream a reality. Legendary crew chief Harry Hyde was picked to build up the team, and Jeff Bodine, a former standout in modified racing in the Northeast, was chosen as the driver. With all the other great teams out there under names like Johnson, Melling, Childress, and Moore, the new Hendrick team faced a monumental task, but they faced it well. And in just their 8th start, Bodine drove to victory lane. This was the beginning of the great team known as Hendrick Motorsports. Hendrick beefed up his facilities and crew for the 1986 season and added Tim Richmond as a second driver. That year, the duo won 9 out of 29 races. Hendrick, not one to rest on his laurels, continued adding to his organization, and by 1987 was fielding as many as 5 cars in a single race. Darrell Waltrip and Benny Parsons were added to the stable of drivers, and Hendrick Motorsports became a very formidable opponent. In the early 1990s, Hendrick made one of his best acquisitions, Jeff Gordon. Gordon had been phenomenal in USAC open-wheel racing and moved to NASCAR in 1990. He drove Fords for Bill Davis Racing in 1991 and 92, but moved into a Hendrick Chevrolet for his debut race in the 1992 season finale at Atlanta. Gordon won Rookie of the Year honors in 1993 and picked up his first 2 victories the next year. In 1995, he won the team's first championship title. The following year, Terry Labonte added another Winston Cup title to the team. This was only the second time in NASCAR history that an owner had won back-to-back titles with different drivers. Gordon would capture 2 more championships in 1997 and 98, except for Dale Earnhardt's stretch of 4 titles in 5 years from 1990 through 94. It was the best performance since David Pearson did it back in 1966, 68, and 69, winning 3 titles in those 4 years. In 1995 and 96, Hendrick Motorsports won 22 out of 62 races, including 4 events during 1996 in which their teams finished first and second. Hendrick faced a personal setback in 1996 when it was discovered that he had leukemia. During his battle with the disease, he witnessed one of the best races ever for his team, the 1997 Daytona 500, when his cars took first, second, and third place. After his recovery, Hendrick again took it all when Gordon won the 2001 Winston Cup Series championship. In 7 years, Hendrick's teams won the championship an astounding 5 times. Going into 2003, Hendrick Motorsports claimed 109 Winston Cup victories, 3rd on the all-time list.
Junior Johnson Racing.
Junior Johnson was one of NASCAR's early star drivers, but it was after his driving career when he decided to move to the other side of pit wall after his last race in 1966 that the former moonshiner really dominated the world of motorsports. Johnson, hailing from Ronda, North Carolina, won 50 races as a driver, including the second Daytona 500 in 1960. He thrilled crowds with his wide-open style, but as a team owner, Johnson enjoyed even better success, winning 139 races and 6 championships. Drivers such as Darrell Dieringer, Leroy Yarbrough, Charlie Glotzbach, and Bobby Allison helped establish Johnson's team as one of the best in NASCAR. But Cale Yarbrough and Darrell Waltrip secured the team's lofty status. Yarbrough won 55 of his 83 career victories in Johnson's cars and became the only driver to win 3 straight NASCAR Winston Cup Series championships in 1976, 77, and 78. Waltrip won 43 of his 84 career victories and took championship honors in 1981, 82, and 85, driving for Johnson as well. With Ford and Chrysler out of racing, Johnson and Charlotte Motor Speedway promoter Richard Howard joined forces to help lure Chevrolet into the sport. Johnson is also credited with getting officials of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, makers of Winston cigarettes, together with NASCAR officials, setting up one of the most successful partnerships in all of American sports. In 1996, Johnson sold his operation to Brett Bodine and disappeared from the NASCAR scene.
Richard Childress Racing.
Richard Childress went from track peanut vendor to one of the top independent team owners in NASCAR. Childress used to sell peanuts and watch races at Bowman Gray Stadium in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He started his NASCAR career working on cars and driving them on the quarter-mile paved track that surrounded a football field. In 1972, with longtime friend Tim Brewer, Childress started racing NASCAR Winston Cup Series stock cars. In the 7 years that followed, they became one of NASCAR's premier independent teams. But Childress, although highly skilled as an organizer and manager, was not the driver he needed to be in the competitive ranks of NASCAR's elite. Realizing this, Childress stepped back from driving to focus on running the team. But now they needed a driver. Childress recruited a bright young star to finish the last 11 races of the 1981 season, Dale Earnhardt, whose 1980 championship ride with Rod Osterlund had come unraveled. After season's end, Childress encouraged Earnhardt to accept an opportunity to drive for the more established Bud Moore team, which benefited from a significant factory contribution. Stuck without a driver again, Childress hired up-and-coming Ricky Rudd. Together for 2 seasons, Childress and Rudd saw success. Their first win came at the Riverside track in June of 1983, and another victory followed in the fall at Martinsville. Finally, things were starting to work for Childress. In 1984, Earnhardt and Childress were reunited, and things really took off. Earnhardt wasted no time in grabbing victories at Talladega and Atlanta. But that was just a warm-up. With Earnhardt as his driver, Childress saw 6 NASCAR Winston Cup Series championships. In that time, first with sponsorship from Wrangler Jeans and later from General Motors' GM Goodwrench brand, RCR grew and evolved into one of the best in the business. A second car was added, with Mike Skinner being promoted from Childress' NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series championship winning team. Even though he had formed his own race team, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, Earnhardt intended to finish his career driving Childress's cars. The end came tragically and prematurely when Earnhardt was lost at Daytona in February 2001. Rookie Kevin Harvick, driving for the NASCAR Busch Series entry in the Childress stable and scheduled to drive a third RCR Cup entry in 2002, was picked to drive the cars that had been prepared for Earnhardt. He turned in a stellar performance, winning 2 races and finishing in the top 10 final point standings. He also ran full-time in the NASCAR Busch Series car, winning that series championship and thus giving Childress championship titles in all 3 of NASCAR's top divisions. The third team came online as scheduled in 2002 with Jeff Green, the driver. Robbie Gordon replaced Skinner in the number 31 RCR Chevrolet, and Harvick continues to drive the GM Goodwrench entry, which has carried the number 29 instead of Earnhardt's famous number 3. The Childress-Earnhardt tandem remains one of the most lucrative owner-driver relationships, with earnings of over $54 million.
Racing in the new millennium. Kurt Busch.
In September of 2000, Kurt Busch made his first Winston Cup Series start, driving a Roush Ford at Dover. He performed well enough in that race to convince Roush that the Winston Cup Series is where he belonged. So while most drivers had to first pay their dues by moving up through the Busch Series ranks, Busch jumped full-time into the Winston Cup Series with minimal experience. Busch responded by finishing second in the Rookie of the Year competition. Now, Busch knew that he needed to gain as much experience as possible to have a successful second year in NASCAR's top series. His prayers were answered when Roush shuffled his teams up before the 2002 season even started. Busch's team went to Mark Martin, and Martin's team went to Busch, along with crew chief Jimmy Fennig. This gave Martin a successful crew and positioned sophomore Kurt Busch with a more experienced team. Now, halfway through the season, it was obvious that the changes produced resounding success. Martin was second in the points standings, while Busch fared ninth. With less than 2 years in the Winston Cup Series, Kurt Busch has already evolved from a newcomer trying to fit into the NASCAR world to a recognized, legitimate threat on the track. He credits at least some of his quick rise among the racing world's elite to a couple of accomplishments in 2001, winning the pole at the Southern 500 and achieving his first Winston Cup victory at the Food City 500 at Bristol. Now, even though Busch lost 2001 Rookie of the Year honors to Kevin Harvick, it should also be noted that Busch entered Winston Cup Series with no experience on many of the series tracks and little overall racing experience. In fact, many believe that Kurt Busch is the better future talent. given his age and his skill level. Another thing that sets Kurt apart from his peers is his aggressiveness. In one such incident at Bristol, Jimmy Spencer was leading the race when Spencer was bumped out of contention by Busch, giving Kurt his first victory. In another incident, Busch was again criticized for some things he said after the Winston at Lowe's Motor Speedway. During that race, Busch had bumped Robbie Gordon, spinning him out and forcing a yellow flag. Now, Busch said flat out that while he hated using Gordon that way, he wanted to better his odds of winning and a strong finish. Now, any driver would privately admit that this type of thing was as old as racing. However, the fact that Busch publicly admitted doing it astounded many NASCAR veterans. NASCAR officials weren't too happy either and slapped him with a $10,000 fine for his comments. Busch later said he regretted the way in which he described the race. It was a very expensive lesson. There's no doubt that Busch will have a very successful and memorable career in NASCAR racing. He is a bright and articulate young man who is now learning the other side of racing, how to cope with the fame and fortune that come with being a well-paid celebrity. Busch was the hottest driver in the waning weeks of the 2002 season, finishing third in driver points.
Dale Earnhardt Jr.
Dale Earnhardt Jr. has led a life that is both charmed and tragic. On one hand, he has benefited from a family rich in racing tradition, having a grandfather who was one of the top 50 drivers of all time, and a father who was a 7-time NASCAR Winston Cup Series champion, has certainly helped shape the career of this third-generation Earnhardt. But the young Earnhardt has also had to carry on after the loss of his father. Dale Earnhardt Jr. was born on October 10, 1974, in Kannapolis, North Carolina. As a kid, Dale Jr. learned about racing and the family business by performing odd jobs in his father's shop. His first real race car was a red Chevrolet Monte Carlo that he built at age 17 and began racing at a local track. He also enjoyed racing legends, which were scaled-down replicas of modified pre-World War II coupes and sedans. His first victory came in 1992 at the Charlotte Motor Speedway on the eve of his 18th birthday. After completing high school, Dale Jr. attended a trade school for a couple of years and then took a job at his father's Chevy dealership. His first career start in NASCAR's Busch Series was at Myrtle Beach on June 22, 1996, where he finished 14th. Then in 1997, Dale Earnhardt Inc. needed a NASCAR Busch Series driver to fill the vacancy created when Steve Park was moved up to the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. The senior Earnhardt decided that it was time to give Dale Jr. his shot at the big time. Dale Jr. made his NASCAR Winston Cup Series debut in 2000, along with NASCAR Busch Series rival Matt Kenseth, and everyone was predicting good things from that year's rookies. Dale Jr., given the nickname Little E, got his first NASCAR Winston Cup victory at Texas in just the 12th start of his career. He added another victory at Richmond and became the first rookie to win NASCAR's All-Star race, the Winston. But he lost the rookie title to his buddy and rival, Kenseth. 2001 was going to be a banner year for the Earnhardt family. With both Dales in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series now, they were looking forward to some good times, but that didn't happen. In the first race of the season, the Daytona 500, Michael Waltrip edged Dale Earnhardt Jr. to win the checkered flag. However, as the drivers gathered to celebrate, it became apparent that something had gone wrong with the car driven by the senior Earnhardt. And in a race in which the Earnhardt team had done very well, the worst possible news soon was learned. Dale Earnhardt had been lost when his car was slammed into the outside wall in Turn 4. The loss of his father was devastating to Dale Jr., and it no doubt affected his performance for the remainder of the year. However, he did manage several very emotional wins in 2001, including the July race in Daytona, the September race at Dover following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the October race at Talladega. Dale Jr. finished his second full season at a respectable 8th in the point standings. With a very difficult year behind him, Dale Jr. began the 2002 season fully focused on the upcoming schedule, and it didn't take long for his renewed commitment to bear fruit. He won the first NASCAR Busch Series race of the season at Daytona, and then took second at the Bud Shootout. Dale Jr. also got his 6th career win at Talladega. But what may have impressed fans even more than his resiliency after facing so much adversity was a race he could have won but didn't. In the Winston All-Star race at Charlotte, Dale Jr. had an opportunity to bump leader Ryan Newman's car. He chose not to, even though doing so would have allowed him to win, and Newman won the race. This single action speaks volumes about Dale Earnhardt Jr. and underscores a fundamental difference between him and his father, the Intimidator. Indeed, Dale Jr. represents the new breed of NASCAR driver, more rock star than cowboy. In many ways, this has moved the drivers of today into the mainstream of American culture and furthered NASCAR's appeal across a broader spectrum of fans. He still surfs the internet and likes to sleep late. He still likes to hang out with his buddies, often in the basement of the house he built on Earnhardt land, not far from the trailer where he lived just a few years ago. Earnhardt Jr. turned that basement into his own nightclub, complete with floor-to-ceiling speakers, and nicknamed it Club E. In the past year, however, he's redone things and turned a place where he and his pals used to party into a place where they now more often just chill out.
Ryan Newman.
Indiana native Ryan Newman is a force to be reckoned with. Although a virtual unknown just a few short years ago, Newman rose to the Winston Cup Series with nearly perfect performance. In fact, during the first half of the 2002 Winston Cup season, the only thing Newman didn't do was win a points race. In spite of that, he entered the season's second half sitting in 12th place in the standings with 2 poles. Newman also won the Winston, NASCAR's All-Star race, and although the victory didn't earn any points, it earned him a nice chunk of money and a great deal of respect. Newman was well armed in 2002, backed by owner Roger Penske, and teamed up with 1989 Winston Cup Series champion Rusty Wallace. His biggest challenge of the season was another rookie driver, Jimmy Johnson. Now, during almost any other season, the numbers that Newman was putting up would earn him Rookie of the Year, but Johnson seemed to always be just a little better. Halfway through the season, Johnson had 2 victories and had beaten Newman 11 out of 18 times. Newman also has something else that few other active Winston Cup drivers have, a college degree in vehicle structure engineering. He earned it from Purdue University while he raced USAC open-wheel cars. Now, Newman is a prototype for the new breed of NASCAR driver, intelligent, soft-spoken, hard-working, and technologically savvy. His engineering background and fundamental understanding of principles such as aerodynamics should pay big dividends throughout his career. Now, racing has been a passion for Newman since his childhood, when he raced quarter midgets as a 4-year-old. In 1995, Newman moved up to the USAC level and won the Silver Bullet Series Championship in 1999. He is now in the Quarter Midget Hall of Fame. Newman began stock car racing in 2000, driving in a Michigan ARCA race where he finished 7th. He seemed to grasp the subtle nuances of stock cars quickly. In his second race at Pocono, he won. After winning at Pocono, Newman claimed victories at both Kentucky and Charlotte and set a new qualifying record for stock cars at Charlotte with speeds just under 187 miles per hour. Now, of course, having NASCAR legend Buddy Baker as his driving coach helped get Newman started out right. And in fact, Baker continued to mentor Newman when he took his next big step, the Winston Cup Series. Newman first raced in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series in 2001, when Penske put him in a small number of races in addition to his 15 NASCAR Busch Series schedule. This allowed Newman to maintain his rookie status the next year. He shocked NASCAR by winning the pole in the Coca-Cola World 600, not too bad for his 3rd career start. But so far, the biggest race and most important victory to Newman is the Winston in 2002, when he beat Dale Earnhardt Jr. for the win. In fact, just after the race, it was Earnhardt Jr. who was among the first to join Newman in victory lane and offer his congratulations. In a way, it was very fitting that he do so. After all, Earnhardt Jr. is the only other driver to win the Winston as a rookie. If you made a list of the people to which Newman owes his success, one of those names would also have to include Matt Borland. Borland joined the Penske operation in 1999 as an engineer, and in April of 2000 was picked to be Newman's crew chief. Now, under his guidance, Newman was able to win 3 races and 2 poles in just 5 ARCA starts. Thanks to people like Borland, Penske, and minority owners Don Miller and Rusty Wallace, Newman is prepared to give other NASCAR drivers a run for their money. He is definitely someone who will be making other drivers glance nervously in their rearview mirrors during any race. But when it comes to Wallace, Newman reserves the right to let him pass. After all, that's what teammates do.
Tony Stewart.
Some people have the type of personality for which there's no middle ground. You either like the person or you don't. Tony Stewart has that type of personality. It's Stewart's approach to life that makes him such a closely observed figure. And the very thing that angers many fans about Stewart is what appeals to other fans, his brutal honesty and outspokenness. It's something that has caused problems for him in the past, especially with the media. The fact is that when you ask Stewart a question, you will get an honest answer. He doesn't hold anything back, on or off the track. But regardless of whether you like or dislike Stewart, you can't argue with his success. Winner of the 2002 Winston Cup Championship, this driver began collecting victories early in his career and at an amazing pace. Stewart of Rushville, Indiana, first gained success racing open-wheel cars on dirt and paved ovals. He won USAC's Triple Crown, collecting titles in sprint cars, midgets, and Silver Crown machines in 1995. Following the career path of his idol, A.J. Foyt, Stewart started on the pole in the 1996 Indy 500 and won the 1997 Indy Racing League Championship. But he moved to NASCAR racing in 1998, competing in 22 Busch Series events while he ran a full IRL schedule. The next year, team owner Joe Gibbs signed Stewart to drive the Home Depot-sponsored Pontiac full-time in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. Stewart responded with one of the most amazing rookie years in NASCAR history. With 3 wins, Stewart finished 4th in the final standings. He was a shoo-in for Rookie of the Year, and his infectious success on the track carried over to teammate Bobby Labonte, who won 5 races in his best year up to that point. But this was just the beginning for Stewart. In 2000, he further impressed the racing world with 6 victories and a 6th-place finish in the final standings as his teammate Labonte won the championship title. In 2001, Stewart won 3 more races and improved on his consistency and chased Jeff Gordon to the championship. The next season, he held off a late charge by veteran Mark Martin to capture the title. Stewart's hero, Foyt, and Mario Andretti have won both the Daytona 500 and Indianapolis 500. Stewart has yet to get a victory in either classic event, but he has done something Foyt and Andretti never achieved: championship titles in major IndyCar and stock car racing. There is no doubt that Stewart will be a major factor in the new millennium. When we began the History of NASCAR DVD project, we soon realized that we had undertaken something that would become much bigger than originally planned. That is because NASCAR itself encompasses so much: the races, the drivers and their families, the tracks, the crews, and so much more, that any attempt to chronicle its origins and subsequent evolution must by necessity be grand in design. What we have created through the insight and talent of renowned automotive writer David Green offers the very best of NASCAR. In the final analysis, we have only scratched the surface, but we have done so in a way that brings you the greatest drivers, the most exciting races, and the truly significant events in over a half-century of NASCAR's existence. We believe that our History of NASCAR offers something for every level of racing enthusiast. Those new to the sport will learn about the people, places, and events that make up this fast-paced sport. True aficionados will be treated to rare footage and interviews with NASCAR's elite. In this event, everyone's a winner. Look for your History of NASCAR 12-volume DVD collector series at retailers near you.